Welcome, dear listener, to another quiet journey into the past. Here with me, your sleepy historian. This is Boring History for Sleep, a place where the noise of the day fades into the soft turning of old pages and the stories of long-forgotten lives weave themselves gently around you. If you're here for falling asleep to boring history, for bedtime relaxation and soft storytelling, you are in the right place. Think of this as a soft-spoken history documentary, not meant to excite or stir, but to calm, to soothe, and to ease you into rest. If this kind of storytelling helps you find peace at night, feel free to support the channel. You might like the video or even subscribe, but only if it truly brings you comfort. And perhaps, if you feel like it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Somehow, it is strangely comforting to know there are others, scattered across the world, drifting into sleep to the same quiet words. So, dim the lights. Let the murmurs of history take the place of today's worries. Imagine the faint scent of wax candles, the soft shuffle of parchment pages, the hushed corridors of palaces where kings and queens once lived, but where countless others worked, quietly, dutifully, almost invisibly. Because tonight, we turn away from the gilded thrones and jeweled crowns, and we listen instead to footsteps in the servants' hall, to the hands that poured the wine, folded the linen, and stirred the pots in the kitchens below. This is not the story of rulers who sat upon marble seats, but the men and women who carried water, who kept the fires burning, who prepared the chambers, and who, by their ceaseless labor, allowed palaces to function at all. The title of our quiet exploration is simple and perhaps a little playful: The Shocking Truth About the Servants Who Ran the Palaces. But the truth itself is not shocking the way of battles or conspiracies. It is shocking only because it is often forgotten. These lives, humble and repetitive, carried weight equal to that of any monarch's decree. Without them, palaces would have been only cold stone shells. Over the next 2 hours, we will drift through their world. We will explore the ordinary rhythms of daily life inside the great households of history. We will pause to look at the life of one servant whose name, unusually, was recorded. We will wander into the strange and mysterious corners of archaeology, where fragments of broken pottery and faded perils tell us about people who never thought their stories would survive. And finally, we will glance at the contrast between those who labored and those who dined, those who rose at dawn to scrub, and those who awoke only when the rooms had already been made ready. There will be no rush. Each part of our journey will unfold slowly, evenly, like the measured toll of a bell. And if you drift away into sleep before the story is finished, that is perfectly all right. History will still be here, waiting quietly, whenever you wish to return. So rest easy. Close your eyes if you wish. And let us step softly now into the long and echoing corridors of the palaces of the past. Imagine yourself waking in the earliest hours of a palace morning, not as a noble under a canopy of embroidered silk, but as a servant in the cramped quarters hidden behind thick stone walls. The rooms here are plain, with rough wooden frames, straw mattresses, and little else. The air is cool and faintly damp, carrying the faint aroma of yesterday's fires that never quite go out. Before the first light of dawn filters through the narrow slit windows, movement already stirs. The day for a servant begins long before the palace awakes. Long before any noble stretches or yawns, servants have already risen. Some tend to the fires, ensuring that the hearths never die. Others prepare buckets of water drawn from deep wells or carried from streams outside the palace walls. Imagine the sound: the wooden handle of a bucket creaking, the splash of water sloshing as footsteps echo across stone floors. These are the unnoticed sounds of the palace, unheard by those who feasted the night before, but constant for those whose lives were measured by duty. Life for servants was marked by rhythm, a constant repetition of tasks that gave each day its steady shape. In the kitchens, the earliest risers began their work by stoking fires that would later roast entire carcasses. Yet at dawn it began with embers and sparks, with smoke rising in spirals that stung the eyes. In the laundry, women bent over tubs of cold water, scrubbing linen with rough hands, fingers raw from soap made of ash and fat. In the stables, boys brushed horses, lifting hooves, sweeping straw, whispering to animals that seemed more noble than their own masters. Every corner of the palace demanded attention. Floors were swept with brooms made of twigs. Wax candles had to be trimmed, their wicks pinched to keep the flames steady. Beds had to be made, chamber pots discreetly emptied, clothes brushed, boots polished until they shone. These were the silent labors that ensured nobles could wake to order, not disorder. To live in a palace was to appear above the chaos of the ordinary world, but only because hundreds of hands removed that chaos before it could ever be seen. The life of a servant was not glamorous, nor was it truly hidden. Servants were everywhere, and yet invisible at the same time. They were seen but seldom noticed. They were heard but seldom acknowledged. They moved in the background like shadows, part of the machinery that kept the palace alive. And their work never ended. A spilled goblet, a torn hem, a sudden storm that muddied the boots of visiting guests, all became the responsibility of some watchful hand. Someone quick to kneel, wipe, stitch, polish, or carry. Think of the weight of clothing alone. Noble garments were layers of fabric, heavy with embroidery, stiff with dyes and adornments. Each day, servants lifted these garments, laid them out, adjusted them, fastened them with cords and pins. They handled silks they could never afford, touched jewels they would never wear, smoothed velvet that did not belong to them. And yet, they knew these items better than their owners. They knew the exact way a cloak must fold to appear regal, the precise method of securing a headdress, so it would not topple in the midst of a dance. Meals were another endless cycle. Breakfasts were simple for most nobles: bread, ale, perhaps cheese. But even the simplest meal required preparation. The bread had to be baked, sometimes days before, with flour ground by millers. The ale had to be brewed, the cheese aged. All these tasks stretched backward into weeks of labor, none of it seen when a noble took a single careless bite. Later meals became grand feasts, and with them came the grand choreography of servants. Dishes had to arrive in order, soup steaming, roast carved, sauces poured. Servants moved in silent procession, balancing trays, bowing low, retreating quickly. Imagine how exhausting it must have been, not just the physical strain, but the careful attention. To misstep, to spill, to stumble could mean humiliation. Some servants faced scolding, others punishment, sometimes dismissal. And yet, for many, the palace was survival. It was food, shelter, clothing. The work was unending, but it was steadier than what life outside might offer. Still, there was no certainty. Illness spread easily in crowded servant quarters. Injuries went untreated. And though nobles feasted on game and exotic fruit, servants often ate only scraps. What was left after the feast, the bones, the crusts, the cool broth, was their meal. Hunger was common, even within the richest walls. And yet, among the monotony, small comforts existed. A laugh shared in the laundry hall, a whispered song in the kitchen, a quiet moment in the stables where the only company was a horse's steady breathing. Friendships formed out of necessity, bonds of survival. The servants' world was one of endless toil, but also of small, human moments that made the labor bearable. The rhythm of their lives: rise before dawn, work until night, rest briefly, then rise again, continued for years, sometimes for an entire lifetime. Few left their posts. Most faded into the background, their names forgotten, their work unrecorded. And yet, without them, the palace itself would collapse into disarray. So, when you imagine the grandeur of a throne room or the splendor of a feast, remember the hundreds of unseen hands that polished, prepared, and maintained every detail. The truth, quietly shocking in its simplicity, is that palaces were not truly run by kings or queens. They were run by the countless servants who worked while others slept. As the day unfolds within a palace, the rhythm of servant life shifts like the turning of a great wheel. Morning duties flow into midday tasks, and each moment is dictated not by the needs of the workers themselves, but by the ever-changing desires of those they served. To understand the truth of palatial life, it is not enough to glance at the glittering halls. One must step behind the doors, down the stairwells, in the corridors where the air is heavy with the smell of bread rising, where the heat of the kitchens clings to the stone, and where weary hands labor without pause. By mid-morning, the palace is alive. Fires blaze in hearths, their smoke curling through chimneys. Bells ring to summon movement, sometimes calling for food, sometimes for water, sometimes for a chamber to be ready for a guest who arrived without warning. These bells were the heartbeat of the palace, and servants learned to anticipate them. A delay, even of moments, could mean displeasure. So servants waited, always listening, always prepared to move quickly but quietly, to answer needs before voices were raised. Kitchens at this hour were a world unto themselves. Imagine long wooden tables dusted with flour, knives glinting in the firelight, baskets of herbs brought in from gardens, meat hung from hooks in storerooms, salted and preserved, jugs of ale-lined shelves, barrels stacked high against the walls. There was noise here, the crackle of fire, the rhythmic pounding of dough, the clatter of pots, but it was controlled noise, purposeful. A kitchen was an orchestra of labor, and every servant had a part to play. The scullion scrubbed pots blackened from fire. The cooks, often feared and respected, commanded assistants to chop, grind, and stir. Apprentices scurried about, carrying trays and fetching water. Above the kitchens, nobles might only smell the faint aroma of roasted meat or stewed vegetables. They would never see the sweat on brows, the smoke in eyes, the sore backs from bending over heavy pots. For them, food simply appeared as if by magic. For the servants, every bite of that food was hours of preparation. Outside in the courtyard and gardens, other servants tended the grounds. Imagine them raking gravel paths smooth, trimming hedges, gathering herbs not just for flavor but for medicine. They worked in all seasons. In winter, they cleared snow and broke ice, ensuring that nobles could walk without soiling their boots. In summer, they watered gardens under the hot sun. The palace grounds were a stage, and their perfection mattered just as much as the hall within. Laundry, too, was endless. The nobles' garments, heavy with fabric and decoration, demanded careful washing. Servants carried basins of water heated over fire, scrubbing until their hands ached, wool shrank if mishandled. Silk stained easily, linen required pounded with paddles to soften. Clothes were laid out to dry in open air, sometimes frozen stiff in winter, sometimes yellowed by too much sun. The work was tedious, but mistakes could mean ruin, for noble clothing cost more than a servant could earn in years. By midday, meals were served, and this was when the greatest bustle began. Trays moved in procession. Dishes were carried up and down stairways, each step carefully measured. Some servants learned to balance trays high above their heads, weaving through crowded halls without spilling a drop. Others stood silently behind chairs, ready to refill cups or sweep crumbs. A feast was not only food, it was spectacle, ritual, and a test of discipline for the staff who made it possible. When the nobles dined, the servants rarely ate. Instead, they waited, often in side rooms, for scraps to be returned. Bones, crusts of bread, cooled vegetables. These became their meals. Sometimes they were lucky, and a roast too large or finishing or a pie cut unevenly found its way into the servant hall. But most often, their meals were simple and plain, in stark contrast to the delicacies they carried upstairs. Afternoons were filled with maintenance tasks. Floors swept, rushes replaced. In many palaces, floors were covered not with rugs but with bundles of dried rushes, sometimes mixed with herbs to mask unpleasant smells. These needed frequent replacement, for they wore down quickly under the weight of boots. Candles, too, had to be tended constantly. Without them, the stone halls were dim, especially in winter. Servants trimmed wicks, replaced melted stubs, and carried trays of new candles up and down stairwells, ensuring light remained constant. In noble chambers, beds were remade, curtains drawn back, linen shaken, pillows fluffed. Some servants specialized in chamber service, and their duties required silence, discretion, and constant attention to detail. Imagine them moving softly, arranging cushions, adjusting the angle of a stool, ensuring a robe was folded neatly. Their presence was felt more than seen. By evening, the palace prepared for another round of dining. Torches were lit, shadows danced across stone walls, music played by hired performers. Servants moved again in careful procession, carrying dishes, pouring drinks, sweeping away crumbs. The day ended much as it began, with work. And when nobles finally retired to their chambers, their bellies full and their minds softened by drink, servants continued. Fires had to be banked for the night, doors barred, chambers checked, clothing laid out for the morning. Only then, in the deep hours of the night, could servants rest. Their sleep was never long, for dawn always came quickly. The cycle repeated day after day, with only slight variations. The arrival of guests, the change of seasons, the celebration of feasts, all altered the pace but not the substance. The work was constant, steady, unrelenting. And yet, in that repetition, there was order. For servants, the rhythm of their labor was the rhythm of their lives. It gave shape to their days, identity to their existence. It was not a life of luxury nor of freedom, but it was a life bound to the very heart of the palace. The grandeur above could not exist without the toil below. The palace, in truth, was less the house of a king or queen, and more the house of its servants. Night inside a palace was a world of its own. To the nobles, it might have seemed like a time of rest. Chambers lit by the soft glow of candles, heavy curtains drawn against the chill, beds layered with blankets. Yet even in these hours, the servants' duties continued, weaving through the darkness like a second, hidden life. Torches had to be checked and replaced, for without them, the corridors would plunge into shadows, so deep one could lose their way between chambers. Fires were banked carefully, embers covered in ash to keep their warmth alive until morning. Some servants walked the halls as night watchmen, their steps echoing faintly as they carried lanterns, ensuring doors were closed, gates secure, and no intruder slipped silently into the palace grounds. Others tended to nobles in their chambers. Maids called odd hours, bringing warm wine or fetching an extra blanket. In great houses, bells or clappers allowed nobles to summon help even in the middle of the night. For the servants, sleep was never guaranteed. A single call could tear them from their pallets and send them hurrying along cold stone floors, barefoot, shivering, but obedient. Imagine the silence broken only by the faint creak of wood, the drip of water from a leaky roof, or the distant sigh of wind through arrow slits. In this quiet, the palace felt different, less like a seat of power, more like a vast and lonely cavern, filled with shadows that only servants learned to navigate. They knew which stairways groaned, which doors scraped against stone, where the draft seeped in during winter. Their intimacy with the palace was deeper than that of any noble. They lived not in its showy chambers, but in its bones. The seasons shaped this life as much as any master's will. In winter, the work grew harsher. Fires had to be fed constantly. Snow cleared from paths, water hauled when wells froze over. Servants' quarters were cold, their breath visible as they slept huddled together for warmth. The nobles above layered themselves in furs, but below, servants often relied on worn wool or patched garments, fingers stiff as they scrubbed, carried, and stitched. Summer brought a different weight. The heat of kitchens was stifling, flames leaping high as pots boiled and spits turned. Sweat soaked through linen tunics, and the air grew thick with the mingled smells of roasting meat, herbs, and smoke. Outside, gardens demanded endless care, watering, weeding, harvesting. Flies buzzed, food spoiled more quickly, and work stretched longer with the extended hours of daylight. Spring and autumn were seasons of transition, marked by preparations. In spring, rushes were gathered fresh to cover the floors. Herbs hung to dry, new linens woven for the year ahead. In autumn, granaries filled with stored grain, barrels sealed with ale, salted meat packed tightly for the coming cold. Each season had its own rhythm, its own demands, and the servants moved in tune with them, as reliable as the turning of the earth itself. Despite the hardships, the palace was a place of skill as well as labor. Servants became masters of their crafts. Cooks who could balance flavors with herbs alone, laundresses who could coax stains from the most delicate silk, grooms who could calm a restless horse with a touch. These skills were rarely celebrated, but they were essential, passed down quietly from one generation of servants to the next. There was also hierarchy within the servant world. Some held more authority than others. The steward oversaw the household. The butler guarded the wine cellars. The head cook commanded the kitchens. Under them worked layers of assistants, apprentices, and boys or girls just beginning their lives of service. This hierarchy mirrored the nobles above, but in miniature, and it determined everything from sleeping quarters to meals. Most servants, however, remained at the bottom of this structure. Their tasks were the heaviest, their food the simplest, their names the easiest to forget. They were the ones who rose first and retired last, who scrubbed floors, emptied waste, hauled loads too heavy for their frames. And yet, their labor was the foundation of the palace itself. Without them, the hierarchy above, both noble and servant, would collapse. Think of the irony. Nobles lived in splendor to display their wealth, but the wealth could not be displayed without the effort of those who had none. Power resided in gilded halls, but the halls could not gleam without the endless scrubbing of powerless hands. The more magnificent a palace appeared, the more invisible labor it required. And still, these lives passed quietly with little recognition. Very few names survive to us. Payrolls, account books, and rare letters preserve fragments. One may dismiss a cook ill, a boy replaced. Beyond these traces, silence. The voices of the servants, their jokes, their sorrows, their whispered songs as they worked, all have faded. Tonight, though, in this quiet space, we linger with them. We imagine their footsteps, their weary smiles, the rhythm of their days. For though history often forgets them, their presence was constant. The palace walls themselves hold the memory of their touch, the echo of their movements, the weight of their labor. And as the candlelight dims and the palace night stretches on, you can almost hear them, the unseen hands that never rested, the quiet workers who, though invisible, kept the heart of the palace beating. History, when it does bother to glance at the lives of servants, often reduces them to nameless figures, a maid dismissed, a cook replaced. Yet every so often, through the chance survival of a record, one of these quiet lives comes into sharper focus. Tonight, let us pause with such a figure. John Maltravers, a servant recorded in the household of an English noble family during the late medieval period. His is not the story of a ruler or general. It is the story of a man who spent his life moving through corridors, bowing in great halls, and serving at tables, his world framed by duty and discretion. John appears first in an account book, his wages listed alongside payments for candles and flour. He earned a modest sum, enough for food and the plain clothing he wore, but little else. He was described as a yeoman of the chamber, a role that placed him above the lowest scullions yet still firmly within the servant hierarchy. His duties were personal, intimate, and unending. He prepared chambers, tended garments, and served meals directly to his lord. Imagine his mornings, rising before the sun, adjusting his tunic, fastening a belt of leather worn thin from years of use. His quarters were small, his bed shared with another servant to conserve warmth in winter. He washed quickly from a basin of cool water, then moved silently through the corridors toward his tasks. His first responsibility was to ensure that his lord's chamber was ready. Fires were kindled, bedding arranged, garments laid out in careful order. A noble's day began in comfort only because John's day began in labor. He was expected not only to serve, but to anticipate. A forgotten garment, an unpolished shoe, a misplaced item could bring reprimand. And so John learned to observe carefully, to predict needs before they were spoken. This skill, silent, subtle, was the mark of a good servant. To be invisible, yet indispensable. John's wages were small, but occasionally he received gifts, an old cloak from his master, a pair of shoes worn only once by a noble, scraps from a feast. Such hand-me-downs were common. They were practical tokens, yet they carried weight. A servant dressed in his lord's cast-offs carried a reminder of status upon his back. Always second-hand, always borrowed, never truly his own. Yet John was not entirely without agency. He managed, over time, to marry a laundress within the same household. Together they shared their meager earnings, raising a child who also, in later years, entered service. Such was the cycle. Children of servants often became servants themselves, for the palace offered stability, if not freedom. One record, faint but telling, notes that John once accompanied his lord on a journey to a neighboring estate. For him, travel was rare, and though he did not ride in comfort, he saw new landscapes, fields, rivers, villages beyond the palace walls. But even this glimpse of the wider world was through the lens of duty. He carried his master's belongings, prepared his chamber in unfamiliar lodgings, served meals on the road. The journey was not his own, but an extension of another's. The household roles listed service for over 2 decades. Imagine the years blending together, the endless repetition of tasks, the silent observation of noble lives unfolding while his own remained steady, quiet, unchanging. Children of his lords grew into adults, married and departed, while John remained in service, preparing rooms, tending fires, carrying trays. There is a note, brief, almost casual, that he fell ill one winter. He was excused from duties for several weeks, an unusual kindness in a world where illness often meant replacement. Perhaps he was valued, or perhaps it was simply too difficult to find another so accustomed to his master's habits. In any case, he recovered and the routine resumed. And then one day, the records cease. His name vanishes from the rolls, replaced by another. Perhaps he died quietly in his sleep. Perhaps he retired, though retirement was rare for servants. More likely, his body simply gave way after years of strain. No monument marked his passing. No chronicle recorded his life. Only these few lines in financial accounts preserve his existence. Yet in these faint traces, we glimpse the shape of a life both ordinary and essential. John Maltravers was not a hero of history, nor a villain, nor a ruler. He was a servant, and yet, through his hands, the comfort of his lord was assured, the order of the household maintained. His was a life defined not by grand events, but by countless small acts, repeated faithfully day after day, year after year. As you listen now, you might feel the paradox. His story is both deeply unremarkable and profoundly human. He lived in the margins of history, unnoticed, and yet his labor was as real, as enduring as any king's decree. And perhaps in the quiet retelling, his presence stirs again, walking softly through the long corridors of a palace that once depended upon him. The life of John Maltravers, as faintly recorded in ledgers and rolls, invites us to imagine the wider web of human connections that surrounded him. For though his duties were personal and private, he was never alone. A palace was a community, crowded, layered, and constantly in motion. To understand John, we must step into that living world of service, where each figure depended on another, and where a single mistake could ripple through the household like a pebble dropped into still water. John's role as yeoman of the chamber placed him within a delicate balance. He was close enough to his lord to handle garments, to prepare chambers, to stand nearby at meals. Yet he remained firmly a servant, expected to bow, to withdraw, to speak only when addressed. It was a life of constant proximity without equality, close to luxury, yet never allowed to share in it. In the chamber itself, John worked alongside other attendants. Pages, often boys from noble families, fluttered in and out, learning manners and absorbing courtly behavior. Their presence was a reminder of the line between service born of necessity and service as apprenticeship for a higher station. John likely guided them quietly, teaching by example how to fetch, to arrange, to wait with patience. To him, these tasks were lifelong labor. To them, they were lessons on the path to future lordship. Elsewhere in the household, his wife, the laundress, moved through her own cycle of labor. Laundry was endless. Noble families possessed more garments than could be easily managed, and each required care. Imagine her hands raw from scrubbing, her back sore from lifting steaming tubs. In the evenings, when she returned to the small chamber she shared with John, their exhaustion would have been equal, their burdens mirrored. They lived in separate spheres during the day, yet shared the same fatigue at night. The household itself functioned as a small society. Stewards managed accounts. Clerks wrote letters. Cooks prepared endless meals. Stable hands cared for horses. Each role interlocked with the others. If the stable boy failed, a horse might go lame, delaying a journey. If the laundress faltered, a noble might lack proper garments for a feast. If John made an error, his lord's comfort was disrupted and displeasure followed. The smoothness of noble life rested on countless invisible balances. Occasionally, John would have seen glimpses of the world outside his duties. Religious festivals, feast days, weddings, or the arrival of important guests changed the tempo of palace life. Great banquets demanded elaborate preparation. He may have stood, still as a shadow, in the corner of a hall lit with hundreds of candles, watching nobles feast on venison and swan, while minstrels played and dancers whirled. For him, the music was background to duty, the food untouchable, the laughter not as a share. And yet, these moments gave him sights and sounds that most villagers outside the palace would never witness. When visitors came, John's work grew heavier. Beds had to be made ready, chamber pots discreetly placed, water heated for baths. The constant movement of servants must have resembled a tide, flowing silently through the corridors, setting and resetting the stage for noble life. The nobles themselves might remember only the feast, the dancing, the conversations. The servants remembered the lifting, the sweeping, the endless fetching of firewood and jugs of ale. Despite the weight of this labor, the palace offered something many peasants lacked: permanence. For villagers in the countryside, a bad harvest could mean ruin. For soldiers, war meant danger and short lives. For John and his wife, the palace was steady. The work was hard, the hours long. But there was food, there was shelter, and there was a certainty that tomorrow's tasks would resemble today's. It was not freedom, but it was stability. We also catch a faint glimpse of John's personality in those scattered notes. His illness, recorded with unusual care, hints that he was valued, perhaps even trusted. That trust, once earned, was fragile but precious. Nobles relied on servants not only for labor, but for discretion. Servants knew secrets, private conversations overheard, letters glimpsed, gestures noted. John, tending chambers and waiting quietly, would have seen and heard far more than he ever admitted. The greatest virtue of a chamber servant was silence. What did John think as he stood in corners and moved silently through corridors? Did he envy the nobles whose lives he served? Or did he accept his lot as part of the natural order, never questioning, never wishing for more? We cannot know. History gives us his duties, his wages, his illness, but not his thoughts. And so we imagine him with humility, a man of quiet endurance, neither bitter nor content, but steady. The final disappearance of his name from the records is no less poignant for its ordinariness. A life concluded not with fanfare, but with silence. And yet, the silence itself speaks. It reminds us that the palaces we admire, the histories we read, were built not only by kings and queens, but by countless Johns, men and women whose work left no monument, but whose presence was essential. As you lie here listening, perhaps you feel the rhythm of John's days echoing faintly across the centuries. Rising early, working steadily, retreating into shadows, repeating each act with quiet constancy. His life may not excite, but it was real and it mattered. The palace could not have functioned without him. And so, in remembering him, we remember them all, the invisible multitude who carried the burden of grandeur upon their shoulders. As we leave behind the faint traces of John Maltravers' life, it is worth pausing to reflect on what his story reveals. His name, preserved in household rolls, was not meant to survive as a tale for future generations. It was a simple entry in an account. Wages owed, food allotted, duties assigned. And yet, centuries later, those small notations allow us to imagine the shape of a life lived in service, steady and unseen. For John, and for countless others like him, life unfolded within walls that were never truly their own. Palaces gave them shelter, but not ownership. They moved through spaces designed to dazzle guests and glorify nobles. Yet their footsteps never echoed in the official chronicles. Their existence was practical, essential, and uncelebrated. And yet, think of the quiet dignity of such a life. Every day, John rose to the same tasks, repeated endlessly, laying out garments, tending fires, preparing rooms. There was no acclaim, no reward beyond wages, no expectation of remembrance. Yet he did it nonetheless. In the background of banquets, in the silence of chambers, in the flickering firelight of the night watch, he kept the household turning. It is tempting to view such a life as only hardship. And yes, the hardships were real. The hours were long. The labor was demanding. The rewards were few. But there was also familiarity, routine, a sense of place. In the world beyond palace walls, uncertainty reigned. Famine, war, shifting fortunes. These could sweep away the lives of peasants and even lesser nobles. Within the palace, however modest his position, John knew his role. He belonged to a system that, though rigid, provided continuity. There is also something human in the small details. The note of his illness, sparing him duties for a time, suggests compassion or at least necessity. The gift of an old cloak, once worn by a noble, became not only warmth against winter, but also a reminder that servants were part of the noble household's fabric, stitched and though never fully acknowledged. His marriage to the laundress speaks of companionship, of two weary people finding comfort in each other, sharing bread and words at the end of long days. These are fragments, but they allow us to imagine smiles, quiet conversations, laughter in stolen moments, humanity persisting even under the weight of duty. When John's name vanishes from the records, the silence is heavy. It is the same silence that covers almost all servants of history. We do not know where he was buried, what final words were spoken over him. whether his wife and child mourn in private or simply continue with their tasks because they had no choice. History passes over such questions, leaving us only to guess. And yet, perhaps that is fitting. Servant lives were never about spectacle. They were about constancy. Their legacy lies not in monuments or chronicles, but in the very survival of the palaces themselves. Without their endless attention, the chambers would have fallen to dust. The feast would never have been served. The nobles would have sat in cold, dim rooms, hungry and disordered. In that sense, John Maltravers and every servant like him shaped history in ways that remain invisible. They enabled the grandeur of their masters. They built the stage upon which kings and queens performed. Their reward was not glory, but the quiet knowledge that tomorrow is always the fires that need tending, the clothes brushing, the floor sweeping. As you lie here listening, you may notice how their rhythm mirrors our own need for repetition, for patterns that soothe. The cycle of their days, rise, work, eat, sleep, repeat, is not unlike the steady rhythm of your breath. In and out, constant and unbroken, sustaining life quietly without applause. So tonight we let John rest. We imagine him walking once more through the corridors, arranging garments with steady hands, bowing silently in a great hall filled with music not his own. We allow him at last to be remembered, not just as an entry in a ledger, but as a man who lived, worked, loved, and faded into the long silence of history. And in remembering him, we honor all the others, the countless names never written, the footsteps never recorded, the hands that labored unseen. Their truth is not shocking because it reveals scandal, but because it reveals how easily we forget. Palaces glittered because servants made them shine. Nobles feasted because servants toiled. And history, so often written from above, rests always on the shoulders of those below. History leaves many gaps. For kings and queens, the gaps are filled with chronicles, portraits, and monuments. For servants, the gaps are immense and often permanent. But now and then, through archaeology and accident, the silence is broken. A fragment of pottery, a bundle of laundry lists, or the faint trace of a servant's quarters can open a doorway into the forgotten. Imagine a grand palace, its walls long crumbled, its gardens overgrown. At first glance, the ruins suggest only noble life. A banqueting hall, a chapel, perhaps fragments of gilded plaster. But if you look closer, among the rubble and earth, you sometimes find the quieter evidence. Clay pots blackened with soot from a kitchen fire, wooden spoons worn from constant stirring, a rusted key that once locked the pantries where food was stored, even animal bones, split to extract marrow, tell us of meals prepared not for nobles, but for those who labor to feed them. These remnants speak of the invisible spaces, the kitchens, the storerooms, the servants' corridors. While nobles left behind marble and jewels, servants left behind fingerprints on clay, smudges on walls, the echo of footsteps in the stone floors. Archaeologists sometimes describe this as shadow history, a past that runs parallel to the one we know, always present but hidden. One of the most telling discoveries comes from the great houses of Renaissance Italy. Excavations have revealed narrow staircases, tucked away in the corners of splendid palaces, designed specifically for servants. These staircases were cramped, dark, often windowless. They wound discreetly from kitchens to dining halls, from basements to upper chambers, ensuring that the machinery of service moved unseen. The nobles moved in light and space, the servants in shadow and silence. Yet, without those passages, the illusion of effortless luxury would have collapsed. Elsewhere in Tudor England, archaeological digs at Hampton Court have uncovered vast kitchens, larger than many village houses. Enormous hearths dominate the rooms, their bricks scorched from centuries of fire. Charred remains of bread and bones of cattle show the scale of preparation. Thousands of meals each week, all coordinated by invisible hands. Among these remains smaller items surface: a cook's knife, dull by use, a broken jug, even bits of slate marked with hasty notes, perhaps reminders of orders or tally marks for portions. These scraps tell us as much about daily life as any royal decree. Sometimes the discoveries are more intimate. In one set of servant quarters, faint graffiti scratched into plaster survives. Names, initials, simple drawings of animals or tools. They are clumsy and small, but they speak directly to us. A servant, long forgotten, paused for a moment and pressed identity into a wall. It is not much, but it is defiance against erasure. A human hand leaving proof. I was here. Cultural historians remind us that archaeology is not only about objects, but about patterns. Where servants slept, what food scraps they consumed, even the wear on the steps they climbed, all tell us about rhythms of life. The grooves and staircases at Versailles, for instance, show heavy traffic not from nobles, who use wide and polished stairs, but from servants carrying endless loads up narrow routes. Their lives literally carve themselves into stone. In this way, the palaces themselves become archives of labor, not written with ink, but etched by use. Every corridor, every kitchen, every storage room is testimony to the lives of servants. When archaeologists gently brush dust from a hearthstone, they are uncovering not only a physical object, but also the presence of the countless hands that once touched it. There is mystery, too, in what is missing. Entire wings of servant quarters were often demolished or repurposed. Bedding, clothing, tools, objects of humble life, were rarely preserved. We may never know the exact color of their blankets, the precise rhythm of their songs while they worked, the taste of food they snatched in haste. These gaps remind us that much of human life, perhaps the greater part, disappears without record, and yet the very act of imagining fills the silence. Archaeology gives us fragments, and with them we rebuild. A cracked bowl, carefully mended with metal staples, tells us of thrift and necessity. A cluster of discarded oyster shells, found in a ditch, tells us of meals eaten quickly by those who rarely dine at the grand table. Ash layers from hearths whisper of warmth and repetition. Night after night, season after season, when we lean close to these remnants, we come as near as possible to the servants themselves, not as individuals with full stories, but as presences, shadows that move through time. And in their shadows, we glimpse something familiar: the routines of ordinary life, the need for food, warmth, companionship, and purpose. So, as you breathe slowly now, imagine yourself walking through the ruins of a palace. The walls are silent, the nobles long gone. But beneath your feet, in the worn grooves of stone steps, in the blackened hearths, in the broken pottery, the servants are still here. Their traces remain, whispering softly through time. Archaeology often begins with the grand. Palaces, temples, and fortresses call attention to themselves. But the longer one lingers in these sites, the more one realizes that it is the small discoveries, the overlooked fragments, that tell the richest human stories. For servants, who rarely have monuments raised in their honor, these fragments are all that remain. Imagine yourself walking into a half-collapsed palace courtyard. Marble columns lie broken. The remains of fountains are filled with moss. At first, all seems silent, but then you notice, half buried in the soil, the corner of a wooden bucket, its iron band rusted away. A small thing, yet that bucket once carried water for washing linens, or perhaps for mixing bread dough. Its survival is accidental, but its presence is intimate. A servant once held its handle, lifted its weight, and set it down with a sigh. Cultural historians piece together such fragments like a puzzle. From lists of food deliveries found in storage rooms, we learn not only what nobles ate, but what servants handled daily. The constant weighing of flour, the salting of fish, the endless cleaning of utensils. In excavated drains of palaces, layers of discarded food remain. Not only swan and venison, the dishes of the elite, but lentils, barley, and onions, staples that fed the working staff. The refuse of a household, preserved by accident, becomes a map of daily life. Archaeology also reveals the rhythms of cleanliness and ritual. In one palace bathhouse, the drains were clogged with fragments of pumice stones, used for scrubbing. Servants carried hot water, stoked fires, and prepared oils, though they themselves rarely bathed in such luxury. Their presence is felt in the ash, in the worn paving stones where water spilled again and again, in the bronze taps polished by hands that were not meant to linger. Another telling discovery comes from ceramics. Servants' vessels were often plain, undecorated, fired cheaply. Nobles dined from glazed plates painted with flowers and heraldry, but beneath the same roof, the kitchen staff ate from coarse bowls, sometimes chipped, sometimes repaired with lead clamps. The contrast is stark, but the survival of these simple wares allows us to hold in our mind the invisible half of palace life. Some finds are deeply personal. In a servant dormitory in France, archaeologists uncovered a tiny pendant, just a wooden disc carved crudely with a cross. It was not fine jewelry, not something meant for display, but rather a token of quiet devotion, perhaps carried for comfort. Such objects remind us that servants had inner lives, beliefs, hopes, and fears, even though history rarely recorded them. In their faith, they sought solace, just as nobles did, though in far humbler form. Rituals of labor themselves carried cultural meaning. Scraps of cloth found in drains suggest a constant washing of laundry, a near sacred duty in maintaining the dignity of noble households. Bundles of rushes found beneath floorboards remind us of the endless sweeping and replacement of floor coverings. These cycles, wash, sweep, carry, stoke, became their own rituals, their own forms of repetition, binding each day to the next. Even music leaves traces. At one site, fragments of wooden pipes, perhaps used by servants during their moments of rest, were uncovered. Simple tunes played in quiet corners might have echoed against palace walls, a small assertion of humanity within an environment of hierarchy. We cannot hear the melodies now, but holding the fragment in hand is enough to remind us that servants did not only labor. They also sang, laughed, whispered, and dreamed. There are mysteries, too, that resist explanation. In some storerooms, archaeologists find strange deposits, clusters of broken vessels, placed deliberately rather than discarded. Were these ritual offerings, acts of protest, or simply the peculiar solutions of practical life? We cannot know. The ambiguity itself becomes part of the story, a reminder that the past holds secrets we will never fully solve. All of these discoveries together paint a cultural picture. Servants were not only laborers, but carriers of memory and custom. They brought their own traditions into the palaces. Songs from villages, recipes from family kitchens, prayers whispered in dialects unknown to their masters. Even if unrecorded, these practices left faint echoes in the material record, just enough for us to glimpse them. As you listen, allow yourself to drift into this reconstructed world. Picture the warmth of a kitchen hearth, the clatter of earthenware bowls, the faint murmur of voices as water splashes from a bucket into a basin. Imagine yourself running your hand across a rough ceramic shard, cool and uneven, the last trace of life otherwise erased. The mystery of archaeology is not only in what is found, but in what is imagined. The fragments are incomplete, and yet, as we hold them, we feel close to the hands that once used them. Servants, long gone, speak through these remains quietly, like a whisper that passes across centuries. One of the most intriguing aspects of palace archaeology is the way small, unremarkable traces linger in unexpected places. While royal chambers yield ornate mosaics and frescoes, the side passages and service rooms often conceal the real heartbeat of the household. Here, in worn staircases and hidden courtyards, we encounter the faint marks of countless hands and feet that pass by in silence. Imagine stepping into a narrow servants' corridor, discovered after centuries beneath rubble. The walls are plain, undecorated, yet scratched with faint initials, carved perhaps by young attendants with stolen moments of leisure. These marks, clumsy letters, crude drawings, may seem insignificant, yet they are acts of presence, as if those who labored there wished, even briefly, to assert, "I was here." Some archaeological discoveries are even more subtle. On palace floors, grooves worn into stone reveal the paths of daily repetition. One can trace where water buckets were carried, where heavy trays pass again and again. Such invisible maps of motion capture not the grandeur of state ceremonies, but the steady rhythm of work. Walking these grooves in imagination, we almost hear the echo of hurried steps, the soft clatter of tools, the sigh of weariness. In certain excavated kitchens, storage jars still bear traces of the grains they once held. Barley husks cling to the interiors. Wheat dust lies in cracks. These remnants tell us about what was consumed not only by nobles above, but by the servants who handled it all. The smell of grain, the texture of flour on the hands, the endless sweeping of spilt kernels. Such sensory details rise again from mere traces. Archaeology also preserves unintended accidents. In one collapsed pantry, a stack of amphorae was found toppled, their contents long gone, their arrangement frozen in mid-fall. Did a servant stumble while carrying one? Was it forgotten in haste? The toppled vessels are mute, but they speak of the human unpredictability behind smooth palace operations. Objects connected to time and routine also surface. Broken oil lamps, discarded once their clay cracked, remind us of nights spent in watchfulness. Servants worked after dark, tending fires, keeping vigil while nobles slept. Each lamp was an anchor of light in shadowy corridors, and even in broken form they seem to glow faintly in imagination. Another layer of mystery emerges when archaeologists uncover hidden caches. In one European castle, beneath a loose flagstone, a cluster of small bones, seeds, and scraps of cloth was discovered. Was this waste tucked away secretly? Or could it have been part of the servant's private ritual, an offering or a charm? Scholars debate, and no single answer emerges. The ambiguity itself feels fitting. After all, the lives of servants were layered with secrecy, their voices rarely carried to official record. We also encounter fragments of sound, though never directly. Bells were a common feature in palaces. Small hand bells used in kitchens, or larger systems of ropes and pulleys that allowed nobles to summon attendants. Archaeologists sometimes find the metal tongues of such bells, separated from their casings, lying dormant in soil. Touching one today, you might imagine the sudden ring that once shattered silence, calling someone away from a stolen moment of rest. The culture of servants is also glimpsed through discarded clothing. Fragments of coarse wool or patched linen are sometimes recovered from rubbish pits. Unlike the silks of nobility, these garments were simple, functional, often worn until threadbare. Yet in the weave of such cloth, in its tightness or looseness, one reads the rhythm of sewing hands, the uncelebrated labor of repair. One of the most poignant discoveries comes from writing. Not letters or chronicles, but scribbles on wax tablets or the margins of account books. Occasionally, a servant left a mark, a half-formed word, a doodle, perhaps while practicing writing skills in a world where literacy was rare among their class. These small traces are fragile, yet they shimmer with humanity. We imagine someone pausing, stylus in hand, perhaps smiling at their own attempt before erasing it again. Through these finds, archaeology creates a tapestry of culture, Servants, though marginalized in official histories, emerge as people who left faint signatures on their world. The chipped bowls, worn stairs, broken lamps, and scratched initials all carry echoes of real individuals. Each one a reminder that history is not made solely by kings and queens, but by the uncounted many who carried their burdens. As we rest within this thought, we recognize a kind of quality in the traces of the past. The grandeur of a throne room may dazzle, but it is the imprint of a servant's handprint on a wall, the wear of a wooden spoon, the faint scent of barley dust, that brings us closest to lived reality. These are the whispers of history, subtle, persistent, never entirely silenced. So, as you drift further into relaxation, picture yourself not in the throne room, but in the servant corridor, with its plain walls and scratched graffiti. Imagine the faint glow of an oil lamp, the murmur of footsteps in the distance, the smell of grain, smoke, and clean linen mingling in the air. This was the unseen life that kept palaces alive. And though it has faded, archaeology allows us to lean close, to listen, to remember. Palaces, by their very nature, were built to impress. They were designed not simply as homes for rulers, but as living symbols of authority, wealth, and permanence. Marble courtyards, gilded ceilings, endless galleries of tapestries and paintings. These were the outward faces of grandeur. But while the nobles enjoyed the splendor, it was the unseen world of servants that sustained it. And it is in the contrast between these two lives, the gilded and the laboring, that we begin to understand the full nature of palace existence. Imagine, for a moment, stepping into a great hall prepared for a royal banquet. Long tables stretch across the space, covered in crisp white linens. Golden cups and silver platters gleam in the torchlight. The scent of roasted meats, spiced with exotic seasonings, drifts through the air. Noble guests, dressed in velvets, brocades, and furs, whisper and laugh as they await the feast. But just beyond the hall, hidden from view, servants hurry through narrow passages. They balance heavy trays, refill jugs of wine, adjust the placement of candles. The grandeur of the feast rests entirely on their unseen coordination. A single misstep, a spilled jug, a dish arriving late, could bring quiet reprimand, though rarely acknowledgement for perfection. This contrast was constant. Nobles dined on rare delicacies, but servants often ate what remained, simple bread, pottage, or scraps. Nobles dressed in fabrics imported from across continents. Servants wore garments patched and repatched until the cloth itself seemed weary. Nobles awoke in chambers hung with embroidered curtains. Servants often slept in small, cold rooms tucked near kitchens or attics, their bedding straw-filled and plain. The rhythm of the elite's day also diverged sharply from that of the laboring household. A noble might begin the morning slowly, rising with attendants to assist in dressing, surrounded by perfumes, mirrors, and polished furniture. A servant, by contrast, would already have been awake for hours, stirring fires, fetching water, sweeping corridors. When the elite prepared for leisure, servants were already weary from a morning's exertions. In some palaces, the contrast was physically built into the architecture. Grand staircases, wide and imposing, led to noble chambers. But servants were often required to use back stairways, steeper, darker, worn by constant use. A visitor would never see these paths, yet they were essential to the smooth running of the household. It is as though two parallel worlds coexisted, connected by walls and doors but divided by expectation. Ceremony further highlighted these differences. Consider the ritual of serving a monarch at table. Nobles sat in rich seats, eating from gold or pewter, while servants stood silently, always ready but never truly present. To be visible was a risk. To be invisible was the goal. The contrast is almost theatrical. One life lived on stage, the other hidden in the wings, though both equally essential to performance. Even leisure was marked by disparity. Nobles listened to music, watched performances, or walked in manicured gardens. Servants might hear the distant echo of a lute or laughter drifting from a balcony, but they were part of the machinery that made leisure possible. They swept the gardens before nobles arrived, carried chairs to the right spots, or ensured that instruments were placed ready. And yet, the lines were not always absolute. There were moments when the worlds brushed against one another, when a noble child befriended a servant, or when a trusted attendant became indispensable, earning gifts or favors. In these fragile crossings, we glimpse the complexity of human life within rigid hierarchies. Still, such crossings did not erase the larger truth. Lives lived in vastly different scales of comfort, dignity, and recognition. It is this contrast that makes the study of palace servants so quietly compelling. The glittering chambers cannot be understood without the kitchens below. The jewels on a crown cannot be seen without imagining the hands that polished them. To appreciate the fullness of palace life, we must look at both the velvet and the linen, both the banquet and the scullery. As you reflect on this contrast, imagine yourself drifting between the two worlds, stepping first into the bright hall of nobles, then slipping quietly through a side door into the darker corridors of service. Feel how quickly the atmosphere shifts. The noise of laughter replaced by the muted rush of footsteps, the scent of spice replaced by the harsher smoke of kitchens. Two lives bound together, yet worlds apart. This interplay between visibility and invisibility is what kept palaces alive, and it is in the quiet, uncelebrated half that the rhythm of daily survival truly resided. One of the most striking contrasts in palace life was not only the difference in comfort, but the difference in ritual. For nobles, life was shaped by ceremony, structured, deliberate acts that reinforced rank and power. For servants, life was shaped by the invisible labor that made those ceremonies possible. To understand this balance is to see the palace as both a theater and a workshop, one dazzling with spectacle, the other hidden in endless preparation. Consider the act of dressing a monarch. For the noble at the center, it was a ritualized moment, sometimes even a semi-public ceremony. Attendants were carefully ranked. One might hand the stockings, another the doublet, another the outer robe. Each gesture reinforced status. To be invited into the chamber of dressing was an honor for a noble. It meant proximity to power. But surrounding this ritual were layers of servants whose names are scarcely recorded. Linen had to be washed and mended. Shoes had to be polished until they gleamed. Perfumes, oils, and jewels had to be laid out in readiness. The scene that looked effortless to outsiders had been prepared by hours of quiet, repetitive work. Dining rituals were even more elaborate. Nobles did not simply eat. They performed well through the act of eating. Servants carried dishes in prescribed order, bowing, kneeling, or retreating according to custom. A meal might stretch across hours, punctuated by entertainments, musicians, jesters, storytellers, all of whom required organization behind the scenes. Candles had to be replaced before they guttered out. Goblets filled before they ran dry. To the noble eye, the feast flowed seamlessly. To the servant, it was a complex choreography, demanding constant attention and perfect timing. Even leisure was ceremonial. Walking in gardens could be a stage event, with paths swept in advance, flowers arranged, fountains checked for function. When nobles retired to bed, sheets were turned, chambers warmed, and nightwear laid ready. The noble lived within ritualized luxury. The servant lived within unbroken routine. The hierarchy extended into every gesture of interaction. A servant was expected to bow, avert the eyes, and use specific forms of address. Silence was often the safest posture. A noble's words could fill a chamber. A servant's words were rarely invited. The palace was not simply divided by walls, but by language, posture, and voice. And yet, within these rituals, power was not entirely one-directional. Certain servants, by virtue of proximity, held quiet influence. The chamberlain who dressed a king, the lady's maid who overheard confidences, the steward who oversaw accounts. All were technically servants, yet their roles placed them near the heart of power. They navigated a delicate balance, loyal enough to serve, discreet enough to survive, but close enough to wield subtle authority. Still, the majority of servants remained at the margins, carrying out endless duties with little recognition. Their contribution was to render themselves invisible, to ensure that ceremonies appeared natural, effortless, grand. Invisibility was the highest form of success. If a feast ran smoothly, if a bedchamber was perfectly prepared, no one asked how it had been done. Only when something faltered, the wine late, the chamber cold, did attention turn briefly toward those who labored. This divide created a peculiar paradox. Nobles were constantly seen, their lives performed before others. Servants were constantly unseen, their work hidden beneath appearances. Yet it was the unseen half that made the seen half possible. The palace was a fragile mechanism, and servants were its gears, turning silently behind ornate facades. Think of a court festival. Trumpets sound, banners unfurl, nobles dance in elaborate garments. Guests marvel at the spectacle. But just beyond the edges of sight, hundreds of servants are moving, hanging banners, tuning instruments, fetching water, guiding guests, cleaning spills before they spread. The performance is dazzling precisely because the labor is invisible. As you picture this, let your imagination wander. Imagine yourself as a guest at such a feast, marveling at the brilliance. Then shift perspectives. Imagine yourself as a servant who has been awake since dawn, ensuring the fires burn, ensuring the dishes arrive in perfect order. Two views of the same event, both real, both necessary. This interplay of ritual and labor reminds us that history is not only about kings and queens, but about the endless efforts of those who remain nameless. Their rhythm was different, quieter, often thankless, but without it, the rituals of power could not stand. The palace was a world built on contrast. Glittering halls and dim kitchens, velvet robes and coarse aprons, feasts and fasts. But beyond material differences, it was also a world of delicate human relationships. Servants and nobles lived alongside one another, yet in entirely different realities. Theirs was a bond of dependence balanced by distance, a constant negotiation of presence, silence, and service. For nobles, servants were essential, yet easily overlooked. A noble child might grow up never knowing how food arrived steaming on the table, or how their garments remained spotless. Those tasks were as natural to them as the rising of the sun, always present, but rarely considered. Servants moved in the background like the hum of the palace itself, unseen yet indispensable. And yet, servants were far from invisible in lived experience. Nobles depended on them for comfort, for privacy, even for safety. The chamberlain who guarded the key to the treasury, the nursemaid who cradled an infant heir, the groom who saddled a horse before a journey, each held a sliver of trust. These were not bonds of friendship, but bonds of necessity. Servants, in turn, lived with a complex awareness of those they served. To some, nobles might appear distant, indulgent, unreachable. To others, they might appear fragile, even pitiable, surrounded by ceremony but incapable of ordinary life. A king could not pour his own wine. A queen could not light her own fire. To the servants who witnessed this helplessness, the grandeur and nobility sometimes seemed hollow. Between these perceptions lay a tension. Some servants grew proud of their proximity to power, carrying themselves with quiet confidence that came from trusted service. Others grew resentful, their own labor invisible, their exhaustion unnoticed. A noble's displeasure could undo years of careful work. A servant's misstep could be punished harshly, even fatally. The relationship was unequal, yet bound by necessity on both sides. Occasionally, these boundaries blurred. A favored servant might receive gifts, land, or even a modest title. A noble might confide in a maid or a groom, seeking the comfort of someone outside the circle of rival lords and ladies. Yet, such intimacy was fragile. The hierarchy of the palace was a constant reminder. Closeness could not erase division. Servants also developed their own ways of interpreting noble behavior. They noticed patterns that nobles themselves overlooked. The temper of a prince, the habits of a queen, the hidden weaknesses of courtiers. A servant standing silently in a room might witness quarrels, secret glances, whispered agreements. To remain discreet was part of survival, but this quiet knowledge gave them an inner vantage point denied even to high-ranking nobles. The palace was, in this way, a mirror of society at large, divided by wealth and power, but joined by interdependence. Nobles shaped laws and policies, but their daily existence was carried on the shoulders of those who scrubbed, carried, and prepared. Servants rarely shaped politics directly, but they shaped the very experience of noble life. They created the conditions in which power could be displayed, and in which rulers could maintain their aura of authority. At times, resentment boiled over. Servant revolts, though rare, did occur, sparked by unpaid wages or mistreatment. More often, resistance was subtle, a slowed task, a hidden grumble, a silent exchange of glances in the kitchens. Yet even in resentment, dependence lingered. To walk away was to risk starvation. To remain was to accept invisibility. For nobles, there was a quiet fear woven into this dependence. A servant could, in theory, poison a cup, leave a door unlatched, betray a secret overheard in confidence. Trust was never complete. Vigilance was always required. This created an atmosphere of both reliance and suspicion, a fragile dance between privilege and risk. And so, life in the palace unfolded with two intertwined rhythms. In the great halls, nobles performed wealth, power, and ceremony. In the servants' quarters, laborers performed routine, repetition, and endurance. Each group needed the other, though in vastly different ways. Together, they formed the beating heart of the palace. Unequal, uneasy, yet inseparable. As you imagine this contrast, picture the palace not only from the throne, but from the scullery. See both sides of the same walls, the echoing music above, the clatter of pots below, the silken gowns in the ballroom, the worn tunics by the kitchen fire. Two lives lived in parallel, each aware of the other, each shaping the other's existence. And in this interplay of dependence and distance, we see the truth of the palace. Not merely a house of kings and queens, but community, vast and uneven, built upon invisible foundations. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of this slow passage through the hidden life of palaces. We have wandered together through kitchens warm with firelight, corridors echoing with footsteps, and halls filled with music that only existed because others toiled to make it so. We have seen the rhythm of ordinary labor set against the grandeur of ceremony, the invisible foundations that allowed thrones to gleam and crowns to shine. The shocking truth, if there is one, lies not in a single discovery, but in the realization that power was never solitary. Even the greatest monarch depended on the unseen many, the hands that carried, the backs that bent, the quiet watchfulness that ensured a day's splendor. The palace was not merely the house of a king or queen. It was a living organism, pulsing with the lives of hundreds, sometimes thousands of men and women who left little trace beyond name in a ledger or a scrawl in an account book. Their world was full of hardship, yet also of small triumphs. The satisfaction of a floor swept clean, of bread well baked, of duty fulfilled. And though their voices are faint in the record, they linger in the very stones of the palaces that still stand. When you walk through such places today, it is not only the echoes of royalty that remain. It is the quieter footsteps, the countless repetitions of daily life, that left their mark. Perhaps, as you drift now towards sleep, You can imagine yourself not as a ruler on a throne, but as a servant tending the fire or carrying water or smoothing a linen sheet. There is a gentle rhythm in such tasks, a soothing repetition, like the rhythm of breath itself. The past, in this way, becomes not distant but close, folded into the patterns of ordinary life that we still know today. And when you next turn off the light in your own home, consider how far removed your life is from the endless labor of those who lived in the shadow of palaces. There is comfort in that contrast, in the softness of your pillow, the ease of your rest, the silence that belongs to you alone. I hope these stories have brought you peace tonight. If they did, you might choose to like the video, perhaps subscribe, or leave a gentle note in the comments, telling me where you're listening from and what time of night it is. There is something quietly reassuring in knowing that others, across oceans and continents, are lying down to the same stories, closing their eyes to the same gentle words. So, let your thoughts wander where they will. The history will remain, patient and unhurried, waiting whenever you wish to return. For now, may the quiet presence of the past lull you deeper into rest. This has been your sleepy historian, offering you not battles or conquests, but the steady hum of forgotten lives. May the soft repetition of their days carry you gently into your own night's dream. Good night. Sleep well.